Okay, welcome back. We just finished talking about the background image guy and how do you get to an image file from inside CSS. The next one is about the difference between the RGBA, and you could actually do the H one as well, hue saturation guy, versus the opacity property. In my notes, I have a little asterisk here on this one because we didn't actually talk about it that much in lecture, but I made you do it in a homework assignment. Okay, so what's the difference between those two would be a good question. The next one was Chapter 5. Remember, Chapter 5 was kind of a philosophical question, a chapter about doing design, okay? So one of the things we're going to talk about is, the organization rules. What were some of the rules we used for, how tall a structure should be or how wide a structure should be? Remember that? Okay. So that one I don't think should be too much trouble. The principles of visual design. Yeah. So we talked about this a lot, and maybe it'll be one of those things where it probably won't be list the parts of the visual design. And more than likely it'll be a little deeper and ask you questions like, in this example, is this an example of alignment? Or is this an example of proximity? That kind of stuff. Writing content for the web. If you recall from the lecture, we talked about how you don't normally, obviously it depends on what kind of website, what page you're talking about, but most of the time when you're writing for the web, you don't do, complete formal sentences and, like you're writing an APA paper for publication. You don't just take the words and just put them in your web page. Typically you make them short sentences, to the point, more like you're giving a briefing. Remember, if you've ever done this, you have like a PowerPoint slide presentation and they're just bullet points, right? You don't ever read the contents of the slide. They're just there kind of to direct your focus and point you in the right direction. Well, that's the same concept with writing for the web. You don't expect your audience to read every word. You expect them to kind of scan and poke around, and if they find something they want, then they'll read the whole thing. Okay. Almost like test questions, huh? All right. So next one talks about the navigation bar. There's some, you can have a navigation bar go at the top. You can have one go down the side. There's lots of things you can do to make them, visually distinct. You can have, rollover effects. You can have, buttons and all sorts of things that look like buttons. So yeah, I'm going to ask you some questions about navigation bar. Page layout. Remember how we talked about, we had like a 2-column page and all that kind of stuff. Remember all that? So one of the things we talked about was you could have a fixed width page, and the fixed width page could be off on one side, or it could be smack dab in the middle, or you could have one that just expands. Just elastic kind of a design. It expands and contracts. And so we talked about some of the relative merits of that. And depending on the screen size, maybe there's one choice that's better than the other. If you can remember that conversation, then I don't think you'll have a trouble. The next one talks about the box model. And you need to know the box model. You need to know if I ask for a width of something, and then I add on padding, and then I add on a border, and then I add on a margin, what's the total width of that entire thing? Edge to edge kind of a thing, what that actually means. Yeah, you need to know the box model. The next one talks about the normal flow. You remember how typically if you have 2 paragraphs, you have a paragraph above and a paragraph below, right? No big deal, it just flows from top to bottom. But what happens if you had like an image and you didn't want the paragraph like this? You wanted it to start and then kind of flow around. It may end up, parts of the paragraph might end up below, but it starts off to the side and flows around. Okay, remember all that? So one of the questions would be, where do I apply the float, and where do I apply the clear? How does that work? Mechanically, how do I make it do that? So a 2-column layout. Remember how in our examples, in every example we did in the book and in lecture, when we did a 2-column or a 3-column layout, we always took the width of the item that was being floated, and we did something to it when we were trying to do the margins. And I'm going to ask you some questions about, how come we did some math in there between the width and the margin? How come they don't match, for example? That'd be a good question to ask you. This next one is block versus inline. We talked a lot over many chapters. Sometimes I just kind of mentioned the term and didn't actually get into definition. But there's a distinction between a block tag and an inline tag. And yeah, block tags are kind of different than inline tags. And in fact, in this particular context, in this chapter, we're taking things that are predominantly block and we're making them inline. You could do the reverse. You can go in there and tell this inline tag, oh, by the way, I want you now to be a block tag. That's kind of cool. So yeah, you need to know what the differences are between those types of categories, types, whatever the right term might be. Okay, the next one talks about interactive hyperlinks. So yeah, you could have, like, in the context of a nav structure, yeah, you could just have a bunch of links there. You could. Or you could make it a little bit more fancy. Have like rollover effects when your mouse hovers over it, or maybe when you click on it, it'll change color or size or go to bold, and remember which one, like the color will change when you click on something, and it's like part of the history. Those kinds of effects, that's what we're talking about with interactive hyperlinks. The next one talks about positioning. Now, positioning is another of those things that, yeah, just like the box model, you kind of need to know what fixed and relative and absolute, although you kind of need to know, what is static positioning. If I have, relative position 10 pixels, what on earth does that mean? I mean, does that mean, like, just what does it mean? If I scoot it over 10 pixels from what? Where? Where's this thing going to show up? Yeah, you need to know that. The next one is the relative linking. If you recall, if you have like a directory structure in your web page, which if you have more than like 4 or 5 pages in your website, you probably do need to kind of organize them. I mean, like, have a directory called pages and have a directory called images and have a directory called whatever. And so, things are just not all mixed in together. However, when you do that, when it comes to like having a hyperlink or the source of an image, you got to be able to traverse the directory structure, like go up and go over and go down, or go up and go over and over, that kind of stuff. So you need to know a little bit about how relative linking works. The next one talks about fragments. Remember in the lecture I showed you an example of going to one of my web pages that you could cut through all the advertisement junk and go directly to the part talking about the user's guide. You don't want to hear about all the rest of the stuff. So sometimes you want to see the entire article, and sometimes I don't want to see all that. Just take me to this one spot. How do we do that? Okay, if you can answer that, you're in good shape. Sprites. We never actually physically did this. We talked about it a bit. So I'm going to ask you some questions about, maybe the question will be as simple as, what on earth is it for? Or how is this any more efficient than doing it the other way? Those kind of philosophical questions. No, not a do it question, but more of a why question. Printing. You remember how we did printing? We did lots of cool printing effects. So if you know in advance you're going to be printing something, you could like lop off the navigation structure and scoot. Instead of having your content page this wide, you could have it consume that space that got whacked. So now you have a little bit wider room to play with. Remember how we talked about page breaks going on and the cool little feature where if you have a hyperlink, it'll actually show you the stuff inside the hyperlink. Remember all that? All these things associated that only work with printing. Okay, cool. Page breaks, which is kind of sort of the same thing we just talked about, is how the page break. What does page break before mean? What does page break always? What does all that mean? And the next one talks about those pseudo elements. There's some things in here where you can do, like, remember the page break before and the after and the first line and first paragraph, first word, those kind of things. Yeah, I'm going to ask you some questions about those guys. Okay. The next two are, of course, the extra credit guys. And the extra credit guys are going to be, I'll even tell you what they are. All right? How about this? This one's going to be, I'm going to give you a 2-column layout that's kind of half done. And your job is going to be to write the CSS to make it work. So I'm going to go ahead and, scaffold out, a place. It'll show all the tags down here, and I have a blank spot up here, for where you're supposed to write the CSS. And so your job will be write the CSS to make this thing work. Okay. The next one is media query, and it's kind of sort of along the same lines. It's going to be, no, it's going to be more of a philosophical question. And, I love philosophical questions like, what is this thing for? How does it help me? Or a better way of describing that is to ask, describe the problem that existed before this thing came around. That's an excellent way of having you describe to me your understanding of these topics. Okay, we've reached the end. So please, this is an important exam. 15% of your grade, that's kind of important. So please do study. Please do look at the lecture notes. I've told you before, I use my lecture notes when I create these exam questions. So if I'm looking at my lecture notes, maybe you ought to be looking at my lecture notes. Okay? All right. So see you guys next time for the next chapter.